Okay, this is our lecture for week 13, our third class meeting. This will be an online class. So you'll be expected to watch this. We are going to pick up right off of the previous class where you were given a couple of YouTube videos to watch. One produced by USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service, talking about the history of the CRP, getting a lot of different viewpoints. And then the other one was a roundtable hosted by USDA. And that meeting is interesting because it's just what you expect a roundtable to be. You keep going around the table and you hear all these different views. And if you were to catalog and make notes of those, you would see a bunch of people with different affiliations and different views. All of them sort of pursuing the idea that there's an effective use of conservation policy, that there's a good track for it to follow, and that's what we want to talk about today. So, as we've moved towards the second half of this class, we've seen a lot more sort of viewpoints coming into play and tried to expose ourselves to those, and even think about in the lecture that I told you there would be 3 of these lectures. So previously we talked about sort of economic analysis as it's written and trying to deconstruct the arguments that other people have made that we encounter. And so one of the things we might talk about today is, if we read one of those arguments, think back to maybe the Babcock discussion of crop insurance, and you get to the conclusions, and they were certainly well supported, but the idea was that increasing crop insurance support makes farmers ignore some of the risk that is inherent, and if that risk isn't properly priced, then they may overuse resources and may actually cause environmental damage. And now there's a reason to believe that's certainly a valid story, and he actually makes a pretty decent empirical case, right, that there is too high a return in crop insurance relative to what we'd expect a normal insurance industry to provide, but not one that's being subsidized. And so it really comes down to the sort of question: what do you value when you move on? Do you value sort of the stability and maybe even some excess capacity in agriculture being maintained, or do you value sort of preservation and actually moving up front the risk costs of environmental damage? And so it's sort of that playoff. And if we were to look behind the people that funded and supported that work and published it and made sure it was seen widely, it's an institution. It's an organization called the Environmental Working Group. They are they do data-based work. They do analysis, and they hired an independent contractor, Bruce Babcock from Iowa State, an economist, to do that work. And there's no reason to believe, as we read that if he'd found something different, they would have told him, we don't agree, and you only get paid if you produce a result that we like. Now, Environmental Working Group would probably not have publicized his results, his report, so widely, if he had found that there were minimal potential impacts into conservation or minimal potential environmental impacts. And so that would certainly be them imposing their values on what they want to publicize. But there's no reason for us to believe that the analysis as presented is invalid because they have a particular sort of institutional thought or an institutional focus that is actually out there trying to think about environmental work. So if you watch that round table, what I like about that presentation is there's a lot of sort of similar thoughts in terms of what the facts are. There are some disagreements about what the actual impacts will be, but those can be accounted for by people thinking about some sort of different frameworks for economics or science. Whether we're thinking more about how productivity is going to grow and capacity and those kind of things. But then there's also the final one, which is the values, right? So what should be the objectives of government? And that's really how institutions start to take shape, and how we want to think about them, and how we want to talk through these things. Okay, so this slide starts with the idea of institutions in economic policy. We want to know about their role, and I don't have a good definition other than it's some body that has some stakes. So it's typically not a person, but it's an organization or a group. It doesn't even have to be that formal. And as we move on and on into this sort of digital publishing world, it could be just a big Twitter account these days that a lot of people read, and so it's attracted some kind of following, and it goes out and it gives opinions or whatever. What it's not, though, is an elected official. It is not a president. It is not the governor of a state. It's not a mayor. Those are government institutions of their own framework. But they sort of build out their administrations, and so collectively we think of that being sort of the government institution. They interact, they have to work together, they provide checks on one another, even going, we talk about the federal government and the checks and balances, but it also works up and down, the federal government down to the state level, down to city, municipal, which we've seen in when we talked about SNAP policy and nutrition policy. So that's going to be about as far as we go for classification, other than to say that we'll look at sort of federal or government, federal down to state, municipal. Then we'll move over and think about think tank and how there might be sort of the classic think tank is take a department like Purdue has in Ag Econ and move it outside of a university so that it doesn't have a proper student body that it is educating in a broad sense, but it's like an Ag Econ department that sits out by itself. So things like Farm Foundation are the classic think tanks in agriculture. They tend to be nonpartisan. They'll work with anyone, right? They don't care who they're advising, but they may have their own ideology, which is to promote agriculture, to promote agricultural-based growth in the economy, to promote food security, to promote development of rural areas, any of those kind of things. And then we'll think about international bodies. So if you look at these, this government is sort of the smallest level that we have because it incorporates municipal and state. Think tanks tend to be regional or national, and then internationally a group of nations get together typically, and through some peace agreement or treaty on whatever, food or trade, or just, some kind of armistice, whatever it could be, they form these bodies, and those bodies take on larger role to sort of promote common welfare across regions. Okay, so the federal institutions are probably the easiest to describe. They work under the executive branch typically. So you elect a president, and what you're really doing is electing someone to pick the people who are going to run the government. So the president obviously has huge constitutional powers to do things, but the government is too big and there's too much of it for them to do all the things individually, or to even keep staff immediately around them to do it. And so what they do is there's a bunch of agencies. They're called the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, and they all get secretaries. And the president appoints those and appoints deputies underneath them, usually in conjunction with the secretaries of those departments. And then there are also government workers, so civil servants, people who are career or at least currently their career path is working inside the government. They tend to stay through administration to administration, and they keep the government functioning, and they work at the pleasure and the discretion of the initiatives provided by the secretaries, the undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, all the way up to the presidency. Okay, so when we're talking executive branch, that's what we're talking about. So let's think about how it works actually. So Congress writes the laws, the government then hands those laws off to the executive branch to enforce and implement. And so if we were thinking about the Farm Bill, we might think about Congress says there should be a calculation of a base yield, this fixed yield that we're going to use to calculate payments in something like the price loss coverage program. So what happens? Well, Congress doesn't write it all down. They just say there needs to be this thing, and here's how you should probably think about calculating it. And then the Secretary of Agriculture takes that along with some deputies and some employees and puts together a working group and says, let's write what that law would look like if we have to do it. And we do have to do it because it is now the law that we have to make this work. And so they decide what kind of data they have, what kind of questions they're allowed to ask under law of different farmers out on the countryside, and how they'll be able to sort of implement this as close to the way Congress wrote it as possible. And so that's the function of the executive. They do that, and then they have to open it back up. And that's when they call that writing the rules. So the law gets written, and then the rules get written, which is how the law is going to actually function. And those are open to public comment and legal challenge. So if you as an individual see a published rule coming out of USDA and you disagree with it, you can make a comment and say this is bad, or whatever reason you have. The other alternative is if you believe that the way they've tried to implement the law violates the Constitution, then you do what we always do. You go to court, and so typically it's a large group or some advocacy agency organizes a set of defendants, or sorry, a set of plaintiffs, and they sue the government. They sue the government to follow the Constitution, and so you find this constitutional authority. So the biggest example of this, and still going on, is 9 years ago, Congress passed the Affordable Care Act. The president signed it, and there have been a series of lawsuits that have challenged different pieces of that as whether it's constitutional or not, and there's one still going today. And that's because the law as written probably is fine. It's the way that the executive branch, the Department of Health and Human Services, probably wrote a set of rules, and then and whatever taxing authorities, the IRS maybe, wrote a set of tax regulations that fit to that law, and those have been challenged in court. Most of them have survived, but one of them, the mandate, has had a little more difficulty, and that's sort of the subject of. And then, of course, once one thing is shown to violate the law, a new series of law and legal cases come forward. So the policy process never sort of stops in the government. It's always there. We haven't had too much problem in agriculture in terms of sort of the law, mostly because we have normalized and sort of straightened out the way our ag policies have been written. But if you were looking at departments of the executive branch, USDA is a division of the executive branch, and then within that department, it has these divisions. So Economic Research Service is the place where it's sort of the ag econ department of the government. They do economic analysis of proposed policies and actual implemented policies. They are the ones that look at agricultural productivity over time and try to track it and try to match things going on in the economy and explain that to the presidential administration, whoever it is, and try to sort of come up with what policies have had what different outcomes or have most success in maybe growing farm income or in growing or in maintaining small farms, something like that. Risk Management Agency is where a lot of the crop insurance work gets done. They write the rules for crop insurance every year, what kind of contracts are legal and which ones can't be sold. They also have a regulatory component. So if someone violates a crop insurance agreement or commits some kind of fraud, they would be the ones to the ultimate government authority that would refer that case for criminal or civil prosecution, whatever the case may be. Animal Plant Health Inspection, Ag Marketing Services, that's who does a lot of the price forecasting. So when you when you hear market prices or you hear futures prices being reported, it's usually some collection of workers in the Ag Marketing Service promoting that. Farm Service Agencies, primarily regulatory. They work directly with farmers and farm operators, get them signed up and enrolled in programs, and then request the funds from Commodity Credit Corporation to pay out farmers. Natural Resources Conservation Service, we saw one of their videos. They have a regulatory mandate to run the NRI, the Natural Resource Inventory, but also to administer some of the policies on technical assistance. They work with FSA on Conservation Reserve and a number of other things. And then the U.S. Trade Representative, not part of the Department of Agriculture, but important to the Department of Agriculture. So if there's been one place where U.S. agriculture policy has been challenged, it's been in the international arena, whether we're violating trade agreements, and so the U.S. Trade Representative comes into play quite a bit there. It is not exclusively the case that Congress writes a law, hands it off to the executive branch, and then they work on the law and make it, and then just deal with the courts. Congress never completely hands over control because they have their own research service that maintains sort of a living library of policy. We've read quite a few of their papers here that sort of document everything that's happened before in policy, and they try to give definitions to things and provide some context for whatever's going on in policy, but also the Government Accountability Office. So if Congress thinks they wrote a law and the intent and of that law has been misrepresented in the executive branch, and that there's been some kind of waste or failure in implementation, they call on the Government Accountability Office to undertake a review, and that review body can refer those things to regulators or bring action on behalf of Congress to try to fix the law. And then, of course, they have a number of others, but not too important for our purposes. For state departments, every state is a little bit different, but most federal government issues are replicated at the state level. So if you are interested in economic growth and bringing business and trade, those things all happen again at the state level. States want their products to be the ones that are getting export growth. And in fact, most of agricultural policy, through either the way SNAP program is run, through the information that's collected through the state National Ag Statistics offices, is sort of left for states to arrange. So a big piece of agricultural policy is environmental management on the livestock side. And so, for example, Indiana's Department of Environmental Management is required to handle permits and enforcement of environmental policies in agriculture. They monitor CAFO, or confined animal feeding operations, making sure that that those are all compliant with federal law, right? So it's a case of a federal mandate, but states are required for the enforcement. Indiana State Department of Agriculture has only existed for a little over 10 years. Purdue College of Agriculture used to have to staff a bunch of non-political positions to do analysis on agriculture in the state, and work at the request of whoever was in the governor's mansion to try to make best analysis, provide best analysis to the government for policy work. But Governor Daniels, our current president of Purdue, created a new State Department of Agriculture at the time, and that has become the new source of agricultural state level policy work in agriculture that is sort of oversight and monitoring has moved mostly to that State Department of Agriculture. Maybe the state chemist and a few other things are still at Purdue. And then, of course, local municipal law is what it is. They have ultimately they have control over zoning, and that's what we mostly talk about there. So whether things are commercial, residential, some hybrid, whatever you have in a local zoning ordinance set, and then those have to comply with state as well. So lots of times where you're allowed to undertake agricultural production and what types depend on local zoning. Okay, so beyond government sort of is what it is. It does change with politics, but a lot of the sort of functions that people interact with day to day change less so. There was new tax policy. The new tax policy came because the change in the presidential administration. But the way we interact with it, right, going to H&R Block or going to your tax attorney or downloading some forms and filling those out, it all stays pretty much the same. Now maybe the amount of money you got back went up, or maybe in some states, I don't know, I think Indiana mostly had sort of positive tax return benefits, but some states had negative. But so the sort of finances of that change, but largely the way we see the government worked about the same. So government is sort of this slow moving thing. Outside of government, we have these other sort of branded institutions that we call think tanks. And think tanks used to be sort of set apart from universities or maybe affiliated with universities, but they were places that didn't just do science, but they tried to provide best advice to policymakers on what the best paths, what the things that should be favored or disfavored should be. So you get an economist at Purdue, they're writing a paper, they set out what kind of objectives match up to what kind of policies. But as a professional of the federal government, and just like government agencies, you typically just talk about sort of the benefits and costs. You do not say this objective should be pursued over A should be pursued over B over C. It's sort of the academic bent. Well, so think tanks take all that sort of government data and sort of the mindset of university discovery research, and they try to add to it the idea that yes, we can look at the past and think about going forward. What are the right sort of objectives to pursue? What fits? Maybe even looking at attitudes out in the population and trying to say what fits best. And so you end up with a bunch of think tanks that have what we might call, they're not partisan, so to speak. They do not affiliate themselves with a party, but they do have an ideology and that maybe makes them lean more one way or the other in terms of which partisan politicians might pick up their work and advocate for it more closely. So most think tanks have to stay nonpartisan, basically, because it's a way to keep your taxation simple. It doesn't look like a political contribution that way, and you don't have to worry about that part of it. You're just providing analysis, and if someone likes it in the government, a politician does, they can have it. They mostly are public information institutes. Anyway, so if you were just to track the ones you're most likely to see cited, I would guess, I've listed several of them here. The Cato Institute is a libertarian organization. That means small government, basically the ultimate small government institution. So they're very high on government should be small enough, and economic efficiency should be driving the economy. Okay, so if you read some things from Cato Institute, you will say they will say things like there's a market for labor in the United States, and that's what should determine the level of immigration, not other things, right? So there's demand for skills and unskilled labor in the United States. Let that determine migrant flows. They have views on taxation that say there's an efficiency of people spending their own money versus government taking money and investing it. Government should be there to facilitate and make sure that people have these investment corridors for the things that they're interested in, but it should not be doing the collection and then allocation for them. Those are the kind of things you would see out of a libertarian think tank. Heritage Foundation is much more what we call traditional conservative, sort of low tax and sort of stabilization of the economy, conservative in the political sense a little bit, but also the idea that the consumption patterns and the growth patterns and investment in business tend to follow their best paths when taxes are relatively low. That's sort of where they would go. Brookings Foundation is a little bit different. They're probably not so liberal because most economics tends to be moderate to conservative because it is sort of an efficiency-based dialogue in many ways. But you would find Brookings Foundation finding where it would be more liberal would be thinking about market power and being willing to trade efficiency in production, in economic efficiency, take some of it away to make sure that there's no market power that causes basically consumers to be overpaying for things because someone is trying to limit production. And so that might be, where. So if you were to think about the difference between these two as sort of a conservative and then more liberal foundation, it would be really whether there's whether it's natural for some industries to get very concentrated, and Heritage Foundation might say yes, there should, if it happens that the market drives us to only 2 or 3 providers of cable, for instance, or internet, something like that, then that should be the efficient outcome. And Brookings Foundation might say, well, because of the sort of adoption and scale effects in the industry, it turns out that really efficiency doesn't drive it, it's first movers. And if there's barriers to entry for second movers, then those are things we should correct for and try to get the efficient outcome. So both are probably thinking about economic efficiency, they just have different views about it. If you think about attached to universities, there's the Hoover Institute at Stanford, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and those would be different. And then the thing to think about is you cannot match, when we talk about sort of liberal, conservative in think tanks or in institutions or even economics, they don't match well to partisan politics, which jump around, right? Southern liberalism versus northern liberalism versus western liberalism are all kind of different things, and the same thing with conservatism. So it's not what we would call a homogeneous group, whereas economics and sort of the thought structure on what goes on that continuum in economics is much easier to fit. So one of the big issues is what we might call an expansion of think tanks. So one of the things that think tanks were early adopters of, Cato and Heritage, just to name the two that we had there, was publishing. Being open about, this is something we contracted for, this is some analysis we made based on data collected by the government, and this is the story that we think it's telling us. And so this communication arm was quite good compared to dry government reports or academics writing journal papers that maybe are complicated. Of course, we have the Extension Service and land-grant universities that probably doesn't write that way as much, and so it left this sort of gap where other people wanted to do similar types of communication as the think tanks, but maybe didn't have as much sort of analysis going on. And so you see things like publications which attract thought leaders, political thought leaders, and they talk about how the economy changes with politics, and they do what we would call pure political economy, and they bring in writers, and they have sort of different levels of expertise. So if you think about the Weekly Standard, sort of an older conservative Republican origin magazine type thing that has always published and tried to draw from some of the, from Nobel economists, those sort of things. And then a similar one, which is newer for progressive Democrat, is something called Vox. It's just a website, but it draws upon, again, they call themselves the explainers, so they might take a very complicated economics journal piece and try to make clear how trade policy or the trade war with China is affecting inequality or poverty in some place. And then the second group here are much more like blogs, right? So blogs, the traditional sort of first generation blog was find something that happens, maybe some data, maybe a graph, try to explain it to people and get discussion going. And, those qualify under this sort of expanded definition of think tanks because so many people interact with it in that way. And so the way someone sees a really well-written piece of academic or government analysis could be that someone at Vox or Weekly Standard writes a longer article trying to explain the details, and then someone else writes a sort of interaction piece trying to get people to blog and discuss and sort of figure out where it fits in the political landscape. And so there's this hierarchy. I think it's all very interesting, but it does put more burden on the reader to be very critical in all of your reading and be a critical thinker, use the economics and think about whether things fit. And then I was reading an article when I put these notes together talking about cable news and the fact that they all have sort of these experts they bring on to talk about everything. And does that qualify? And a lot of the experts they bring on actually are from think tanks. So if you watch, you'll see over and over. And I just wanted to highlight it here to sort of get the idea because, cable news is it is a set of networks. They're all competing for the best coverage of whatever's going on. And so in some ways you would expect that they would be coming for solid analysts who are good communicators. And so I think it's going to be an interesting thing to track over the next few years to see sort of how that thing stabilizes. Is it able to sort of match what we've seen here where there's sort of a clear direction moving forward on how to get people interacting and thinking about politics. So this is the great treat, or positive benefit of the expansion of blogging and publishing online and interaction through social media is people are as engaged as they can be, or as they want to be, and that access is great. It's just you want to be sure there's no communication gaps, right? If you're moving through publishing and sort of republishing, they call them aggregators a lot of time at these lower levels, people going out and picking up a set of comments and then trying to summarize from those. I think it's the most interesting thing going. It's why I've had you for this most recent assignment, pick out your own reading, and I would like to see sort of what variety we pull together from there and what kind of sources we have. The last thing I'll talk about is the international bodies are typically, there's either an economic pact, so usually trade or maybe some kind of financial setup that's going on, or some kind of security pact like NATO, and they agree, these countries agree and they share data, share information, and they probably even send representatives to some body, some meeting body, the body public, so to speak, to discuss, to analyze, and to set direction for the kind of things that they think warrant economic research. So the United Nations is obviously the biggest one. It's an international law and diplomacy body. We mostly think about it or hear about it in terms of security, but the UN is the probably largest producer of agricultural data in the world, and what they do is they take all their member countries, Australia, the United States, Canada, South Africa, France, whatever. They say, what data do you have on your agricultural sectors We will collect it. We will try to harmonize it and put it in common language, common data language, so that we can compare everything. And that's one of the things they do. It's a huge function. And then they also do projections, thinking about where is food going to come from, going out 50 years, all those sort of things. And then as we move on, you have WTO formed around a trade agreement, and then OECD, which is just a collection of wealthy countries who have taken interest in looking to what role do wealthiest countries in the world play when they think about their trade. They're normally thinking about trade with each other and setting their production plans. What role do they have, and what sort of impacts that have on the developing world, and are there ways to incorporate them even as they don't have many competitive advantages, right? But where can we look for comparative advantages in the developing world and try to incorporate? Other ones, international bodies, development banks. So the big one is the World Bank, and they do lots of research. They do lots of sort of projects and operations around the world, and it's a way to get lending out into places that are capital constrained, because there may be good rates of return available. There just may not be a lot of capital flowing in, and so the World Bank tries to fill that gap. Then some regional banks, Inter-American Development Banks, Western Hemisphere Bank, then the Eastern for the Asian Development Bank. Research agencies, lots of them align with the UN, some of them align with the World Bank, Rice, Livestock, the Food Policy Research Institute, all of these places that if you start reading about policy, you're going to see them quoted, you're going to see them publishing their own things, you're going to see their experts showing up talking about these things because they spend all their time on them. And so it gets to the end of this lecture, and so I think it's less interesting to think about sort of the dichotomy between a good source and a bad source, as long as most of these things, if they're going to survive for long, and everything I've listed in here has a pretty decent survival path behind it, right? It's probably been going 5 years at least, and sort of something that people have latched onto. If they're not using reliable data, they're not going to last long. So if they're not coming from sort of a knowledge point that others can verify, they'll quickly just diminish, right? It's just like a hoax, right? If you write a hoax, once people find out about it, they're not interested in what you do anymore, and so those things go away. The state of knowledge is always changing, so by the time something gets understood and communicated broadly, it could be that it's not as relevant as it was, and that's always a concern, but it does not warrant skipping all the steps and people saying the last time something like this happened, this was the right response. We still have to be thoughtful about that, and we also have to be conscious of whether that's good analysis. Where does that fit in your economics training? Sort of the idea that in the past something happened and we think it caused this, let's do that going forward. There is, one of the things we should watch for, and it's why we did the lecture before this on deconstruction of arguments. We want to be clear that the separation of the policy debate in terms of the values or the positions that politically may be more winning are separated from the economics debate, because if we're going to have a valid sort of growth and learning about how the economy works, we need to be thinking about what are the alternatives for either trying to drive ag productivity or improve access to food, not sort of subsuming those and saying, well, people should be able to move, right? I mean, people should move or leave agriculture if you can't earn enough money, or move to where there's better food access and better jobs, right? I mean, those are different questions, and so you don't want to get those conflated, because one, the economic questions will still persist. There will always be places that are relatively lower productivity. There will always be regions where the supply of goods is relatively low compared to the population. And so what we're really interested in is being well trained in economics, being you guys are all third or fourth year in economics, having had at least 4 classes, and we've looked through a variety of models here. So we want to really understand the boundaries of the economic debate, and be sure that within that boundary, everything there matches up, right? Have they put together sort of a logical structure? Does it fit supply and demand? Does it fit what we think about input and output use in production? Does it fit what we think about people spending their money and making choices on what they want to buy? And if that all fits, then we're just in a place where we're making sure that the political weighting, the idea of values, isn't the thing that's driving the economic conclusion. And if we're good critical thinkers, it doesn't even matter if the author tried to confuse us between these two. We should be able to separate those out, and that's the real value in all of this. So with that, I think I'll shut down this lecture and get it rendered for you. And you can watch it and do the assignment quiz that follows along. Thanks.